where the cold just crawled into your bones and refused to get out. 5 of us got together for what promised to be a thrill: Ben, Sarah, Jake, Emily, and me, Ethan. This year, we wanted something different, something more real. That's how we ended up at the abandoned Tillingham Cemetery, said to be cursed since the 1800s. Locals would speak of strange lights, voices when no one was around, and shadows darting just out of sight. We parked Ben's car a mile from the entrance gates and walked through the woods, the bare branches above, twisted like the fingers of skeletons. The gates were rusted and barely still hanging on their hinges, which groaned as we entered. Tillingham was bigger than expected. The gravestones were crumbling, many of them forgotten. "Last chance to turn back," Jake teased, his voice a little tight, even as he said it. "No way," said Sarah, at his side, pressing on with her flashlight. But the deeper we went, the quieter everything became. The air felt thick with a stillness that didn't belong. It was Emily who found it first. "Guys, you need to see this." We all huddled around her, and in the beam of her flashlight was a tombstone with my name on it, Ethan Crawford, the dates carved into the stone eerily matching my birth year. We laughed at it, trying to brush it off nervously. Then Jake found one with his name on it, followed by Ben, Sarah, and Emily doing the same, each one of them having their own grave. That's when it stopped being funny. Every headstone was together, as if they had been waiting for us. And then we heard it, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of whispers. There was something out there. Something watching. The sun was long since set below the horizon, and the air was taking on a decidedly chillier edge as we approached the cemetery gates. Iron bars, rusted through decades of standing, leaned inward, threatening to creak ominously with the breeze. The trees around the cemetery were misshapen and gnarled, their skeletal branches grasping at the sky like old sentinels of something remembered evil. Ben stepped forward first, grunting as the gate creaked open. "Are we really doing this?" Jake asked, his voice quivering for the first time. "We've come this far," Ben replied, forcing a grin that didn't quite reach the eyes. "It's just an old cemetery. What's the worst that could happen?" I could think of 100 things, but I said nothing. The thrill of fear and excitement was beginning to give way to something deeper, an unsettling feeling in my gut that told me this was a mistake. We stepped inside. The ground was soft and uneven beneath our feet. The tombstones were old, most of them leaning or cracked, some half buried into the earth. Dates over 100 years old were carved into the stones, many so worn as to be unreadable. The cemetery looked like something out of a nightmare, thoughts of time just seeming to stand still and forget. We went further into the cemetery, the long flashes of our lights dancing across gravestones in flickering shadows. I couldn't shake this feeling like we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of the wind, made me jump. Yet every time I looked around, there was nothing but that macabre silence of the cemetery, the trees whispering their soft whispers far away. "I'm starting to think this was a bad idea," Emily said, the tautness in her voice evidencing her unease. "We're fine," Ben said, though even he sounded less sure now. "We'll just be here for a bit, maybe explore and then head out. No big deal." But it was a big deal. I knew it. I knew that something wasn't quite right here. That's when Sarah froze, the beam of her flashlight falling upon something off in the distance. "Guys, look." We turned to see what she was pointing at. At first, I had no idea what I was looking at. But as I got closer, my heart skipped a beat. A row of tombstones, newer than the rest of them, stood perfectly in line. And each one had a name, our names. Ben. Sarah. Jake. Emily. Ethan. A cold chill overswept me. This couldn't be. These graves were new, the dirt around the gravestones hadn't settled yet. My mind raced with how this could be, but there was just no explanation. Someone or something had prepared these graves for us. This isn't right," Jake muttered, backpedaling away. How could they? How could anyone know we were coming here? No one answered. We stood there, dumbfounded and silent, staring at the graves as slowly the implication of what we were staring at began to sink in. We weren't supposed to be here. Then, out of the darkness, a voice whispered a low, barely audible sound that cut through the quiet night air. Our names, each one, in a slow, deliberate murmur. Ben was the first to crack. "We need to go," he said, his voice trembling. "Now." But as we turned and began to walk away, the earth beneath our feet gave a strange, rolling lurch. A faint rustling started up around us, like something scurrying just under the surface. The dirt at the bottom of the graves began to roil and churn, like something or someone was trying to claw its way out. Panic set in, and "Run!" I yelled, as we took off, tripping over gravestones as tattling grew louder, more frantic. But at the gate, we froze. A figure stood blocking our way, a shadowy form, tall and thin, with eyes that glowed in the moonlight hollowly. "You cannot leave," it whispered with malice in its voice. We were trapped. The figure that was standing at the gate was little more than a silhouette in the dark, but the malevolent energy radiating from it was unmistakable. My heart was pounding in my chest, the beats louder than the last, as we all froze, unable to move. The air around us felt thick, as if it was being sucked out of the space we occupied, leaving only a suffocating tension. What is that?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I mumbled, trying not to let my voice shake. But the fact was, I had no idea. Nothing made any sense anymore. The graves, the whispers, and now this shadowy figure, it just seemed like we'd fallen into someone else's nightmare. "We have to go," Sarah hissed, her fingers wrapped around my arm in a painful vice. "We can't stay here." Ben, always the bravest of the bunch or the most reckless, approached the figure, his flashlight shaking in his hands. "Hey! Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't say anything. It just stood there, staring at us, not moving. Its hollow eyes seemed to sear into us, filled with something so much darker than any emotion I'd ever seen in a living thing. Then, without warning whatsoever, it moved. Not walked, glided, as if it was easing sideways toward us in a fashion that made the hairs on my neck stand up. The shadow seemed to ripple as it approached, swelling larger and darker by the second. The whispers grew louder, tumbled around us like a cold wind, burrowing into my mind. "Run!" Jake yelled, the sudden sound breaking whatever spell had held us frozen in place in that 1 second. We turned and ran, sprinting back toward the center of the graveyard. My legs were burning, my lungs screaming for air, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The sound of footsteps our own echoed through the silence, and somewhere behind us I could hear the faint rustling of something following. The rows of tombstones blurred as we dashed onward, our flashlights going wild in the dark. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure right behind us, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the dark, grotesque trees and the looming graves. We reached the far side of the cemetery, where the fence had crumbled away, leaving only a small gap between the iron bars. "Through here!" I shouted, diving toward the opening. We scrambled one by one through the gap as rusted iron scraped against our clothes. Across, the forest loomed before us, its darkness twisted in a tangle of branches, but it seemed a safer haven than the cemetery. I stopped to catch my breath, my chest heaving, and the others collapsed beside me, their faces pale with fear. "Did we lose it?" Sarah asked, barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Ben said, turning back toward the cemetery. "But I don't think we should be hanging around to find out." The wind started to gust, leaves swirling around us. For one weird second, everything went still. It was as if the cemetery behind us was holding its breath, the dark figure swallowed whole. But then, just as I was about to say, "Hey, let's try and get back to the car now," the whispering started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the graveyard. This time, it was coming from the woods. "Oh God!" Emily whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "It's still here. It's still following us." The whispers were louder now, surrounding us, filling the air like the low murmur of distant voices. They weren't just saying our names anymore, they were saying something else, something I couldn't quite make out, but the tone was unmistakable. They were angry. They were hunting us. "We need to keep moving," Jake urged, his voice trembling with fear. "We can't stay here." We forged deeper into the woods. Our footsteps were irrational, a jumbled mess as the trees seemed to encircle us. The deeper we ventured, the more inky it got. Seldom did the moon manage to penetrate the thick canopy of trees above us, and the only light we had was our flashlights, whose lights were trembling as if something was sucking the energy out of them. Whispers grew louder, more frantic. I could feel something watching from the shadows, something far older, far more dangerous than I wanted to think about. The air grew colder, and with every step, it felt as though the forest was closing in on us, pressing down in an attempt to hold us captive forever. Then, up ahead, I saw it, a faint, flickering light through the trees. "There!" I hollered, pointing in the direction of the glow. "Maybe it is a house or a road. Maybe we can get help." We ran toward the light, desperate for any sign of escape. But as we got closer, I realized with a sinking feeling that the light wasn't coming from a house or a road. It was emanating from another gravestone. It cast flickers from a lantern set on the ground in front of a big, ornate tombstone, its surface carved out and glowing weakly in the dark. The ground around it was scuffed, like something or someone had been trying to dig there lately. And at the foot of the gravestone, half buried in the earth, was a body. It was Ben. But Ben was standing right beside me. I blinked and blinked as my mind raced with incomprehending images. Ben was literally a foot away from me, panting hard from our running in the woods, but there, at the base of the gravestone, lay another Ben, his body half buried, his face pale, eyes closed as if he merely slept. "What the hell?" Jake's voice shook. It was barely a whisper as his finger pointed at the body. "That can't be real," Sarah muttered, her head shaking in denial. "It's not possible." Ben moved another step forward, the blood having drained from his face as he stared down at his own double lying in the dirt. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice sounding hollow. "Is this some sort of sick joke?" I didn't say a word. None of this made any sense, the tombstones with our names on them, the shadowy figure, and now this. We'd crossed into some sort of twisted reality, it seemed, where the rules of life and death no longer held an application. "We have to go," Emily whispered, shuddering as she drew away from the grave. "We have to get out of here. Right now." But Ben didn't move. He knelt beside the body, reaching a shaking hand towards his doppelganger's face. His fingers hovered just inches above the cold, pale skin, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. "Don't touch it," Sarah hissed, catching Ben's arm before he could touch it. "We don't know what that thing is." Ben drew his hand back, he breathed shallowly. "But it's me," he muttered, his voice barely heard. "How can it be me?" "It's not you," I said with firmness, though a part of me wasn't quite as convinced. It's something else. A trick. A trap. Whatever's been following us, it's doing this to mess with our heads." The whispers were louder now, swirling around us like a storm, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but their message was clear. We weren't supposed to be here. We had crossed a line, and now something was coming for us. "We gotta go," Jake stuttered, his eyes darting around at the clearing as if something was going to make its move on them. "We can't do anything here. We gotta go on." Ben held his vision fixed on the body for a moment, then nodded slowly. He leveraged himself up from the ground onto his feet. "Let's get out of here." We turned and began to walk away from the grave, when suddenly, not more had we done so than the ground beneath our feet began to shake. It was at first but a vibration, but in seconds it gained strength, shaking the earth beneath our feet. Groaning and cracking sounds echoed through the trees around us as if their very limbs were caught up in some kind of invisible wind. The flickering lantern cast eerie shadows across the gravestones, dancing in wild rhythms. Then from the ground where the doppelganger had lain, a crack appeared almost to be winding right across the clearing, rich with the sound of concrete grinding on concrete. The ground had split open and from the gloom below it started to rise. A hand. It was skeletal, matted with dirt and decay, the bones twisted and gnarled as it clawed its way out of the ground. Then another hand appeared, then a head, a gaunt, hollow-eyed face staring upwards at us with empty sockets, its mouth open in a silent scream. We stumbled backward, terror racing through us as the figure pulled itself free from the earth. More hands followed, more bodies crawling out of the cracked ground, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they hadn't walked in centuries. The dead were rising. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "We need to run. We need to get out of here." But the dead clogged it. More were rising from the earth, their faces contorted in twisted reflections of torment, their bony hands outstretched toward us. The air reeked of rot and the whisperings now a cacophony of voices, each laden with rage and longing. "We're surrounded," Jake hollered, eyes bug-eyed while he looked frantically around for an exit. "We have to make a break for it," I yelled, my heart racing in my chest. "There, through the trees. We can outrun them." I didn't wait for an answer. Instead, I just took Emily's hand and ran toward the tree line. The others followed, their footsteps heavy and frantic as we sprinted away from the grave and the rising dead. The treetops seemed to close in over us, the darkness thick and choking. The whispers followed us, louder, more frantic now, like the spirits of the dead chasing us through the trees. I could hear the rustling of leaves and snapping of branches behind us, but didn't dare turn back. We ran and ran, the chill night air hewing at our skins, breathing in ragged gasps. My legs were burning, my chest aching, and yet I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The fear that had incited this forward motion was more powerful than any exhaustion. Finally, we exploded out of the trees and into a little meadow. The ground was uneven, rocks and roots strewn about, but it was open, no tombstones, no graves, just open space. We fell to the ground, gasping for breath, our bodies shaking with exhaustion and fear. "Did we lose them?" Emily panted, her voice barely audible. I don't know," I muttered back, my heart still racing. "I think so." But the sight of that clearing brought a cold dread settling over me. We weren't safe yet. The whispers were still there, faint but insistent, circling us like vultures. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate and drawing nearer. The dead weren't done with us yet. We sat in the clearing, gasping for air, but footsteps grew louder, heavier, echoing through the night. Whispers seemed to rise on every step, a chorus of voices begging to be heard, pleading for something, maybe for our lives, maybe for revenge. Sarah's face had turned white, her eyes were wide with terror as she looked in the direction of the tree line. "We didn't lose them," she whispered. "They're coming for us." Ben scrambled to his feet, his legs shaking, and started wildly looking around. "We can't stay here," he stated, his voice full of panic. "They'll catch us." "There's nowhere to go," Jake muttered, staring into the dark forest. "We're surrounded. It's like the whole place is alive." The cold breeze that swept through the trees carried more than a chill, it distinctly was imbued with the feeling that something was watching and waiting. I could feel the hairs rise on the back of my neck as unseen eyes followed our every movement. Emily whimpered, clutching her knees to her chest. "What do they want?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are they coming after us?" "They want us," I said aloud, and the weight of this fact was only now settling. They want us to join them. The graves, the tombstones with our names, they weren't just a warning. They were a promise. The air was colder, and there were the steps, much closer now, through the trees, slow, steady. It wasn't just one single set of footsteps. It sounded like a bunch. Where the dead didn't just rise in a single grave, they rose everywhere. "We need to move," I said as I forced myself to my feet. "We can't stay here or they'll find us. We have to keep running." "But where?" Sarah asked, desperation in her voice. "We don't even know where we are." "We don't need to," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "We just need to keep moving. We can't let them surround us." A cold feeling in the pit of my stomach, I knew we were being hunted. We were running for our lives, and no matter where we went, the dead would always follow. They had claimed this land long before we ever set foot here, and now they were coming to collect what was owed. Ben didn't wait for further instructions. He merely launched himself into the woods, and the rest of us followed. Our feet beat against the ground as we sprinted between the trees. The cold air burned in my lungs, my legs shrieked in protest, but I kept on going. The alternative was unthinkable. The whispers behind us became a low, mournful moan, and I distinctly heard the rustle of leaves, the snapping of branches as the dead closed in. The footsteps were no longer slow. They were faster than they should have been and closing in with every second passing. We were running out of time. The trees blurred around me in the darkness, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps, making it hard to see, hard to think. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them catch me. Suddenly, Emily screamed. I skidded to a stop, my heart leaping into my throat as I whirled around to see what had happened. Emily had fallen, her foot caught on a root, and was lying on the ground grasping her ankle in pain. "Emily!" Sarah ran to her side and pulled her up. "Can you walk?" I don't know," Emily gasped, her face twisted in agony. "It hurts." The moaning behind us grew louder, the sound of the dead closing in. I could see shapes flitting between the trees, shadowy figures clawing their way from the earth, blank eyes fastening on us. "We can't leave her." Jake screamed as he ran back toward Emily. "Help me carry her." Ben and I ran to her, grasping her arms, pulling her to her feet. She gasped, hurting, but was able to stand with our help. "I'm sorry," she whimpered, her eyes welling up with tears. "I didn't mean to dash." "It's okay," I said, making my voice steady when inside, my heart was clawing its way through my stomach. "We're getting out of here. We're all getting out." We fumbled our way through the woods, half dragging and half carrying Emily as we ran from the dead. Their footsteps were loud now, an endless, concussive drumbeat echoing through the trees. They were closing in on us, faster than we could move. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, slick with mud and twisted roots. With each step, it was like a fight, with each breath, a chore. But we couldn't stop. We had to keep going. We had to. Then, in front of me, I saw it. A light. Faint, flickering through the trees, but there a single golden glow in the dark, like a beacon. "There!" I shouted, pointing toward the light. "Do you see it?" The rest looked up. Their faces shone with a mixture of hope and desperation. "What is it?" Sarah asked breathlessly. "I don't know," I replied, "but it's our only chance." We kept onward with refreshed vigor, the light growing brighter as we neared it. The whispers were still there, the footsteps still closing in, but the light gave us something to focus on, something to hope for. We burst through the trees into another clearing. The light was coming from a small cabin, its windows were soft and glowing in the dark. The sight of it filled me with a strange sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, we'd found sanctuary. But as we neared the cabin, a cold chill ran down my spine. Something was off. The cabin looked off. The light inside was unnatural, in the way it flickered, and the air around it felt heavy, oppressive. It was as if the cabin wasn't really there, as if it were some type of an illusion. A trap. But we didn't have a choice. "Get inside!" I yelled, pulling Emily toward the door. "We don't have time to think about it." Jake and Ben flung the door open, and we went inside, slapping the door shut behind us. The cabin was tiny, one room, with a dirt floor and a cold fireplace. Inside, the air was frigid, and the flickering light came from an old oil lantern hanging down from the ceiling. We were quiet for a moment, catching our breath. The whispers were quiet now, the footsteps gone. It was quiet. Too quiet. "What is this place?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, my still racing heart leaping another beat. "But we're safe here. For now." Ben slumped to the floor, pale and sweaty. "We can't stay here," he muttered. "They'll find us." "I know," I said quietly. "But we don't have anywhere else to go." Emily winced as she sat down, clutching her ankle. "It's getting worse," she whispered. "I don't know if I can keep going." "We will think of something," I told her, but I had no idea what. The dead were still out there, waiting, and the cabin didn't feel like a refuge as we'd hoped. It felt like we'd just stepped into another nightmare. And then, from outside, I heard it. A single, sharp knock on the door. Someone or something was there. We froze, every muscle tensed as the knock echoed through the cabin. It was slow, deliberate, too human to be part of the whispers, too rhythmic to be natural. I felt my heart pound as I exchanged glances with the others. No one moved. Who could that be?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Nobody answered. We knew there was only one possibility. The dead had followed us. I inched closer to the door, my shaking hand reaching for the rusted iron latch. I could feel their eyes on me behind my back, shallow breathing that seemed to come from everyone else around me. The knock came again, softer this time, as if whoever, or whatever was on the other side was patiently waiting. "Don't," Jake muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's them. It has to be them." We had little choice. If we didn't let them in, they'd break in somehow. I opened the latch on the door and pulled it open a bit, the cold outside air immediately displacing the warm inside air. I didn't know what to expect, but it wasn't this. Standing on the other side was an old man. His clothes were tattered, his face was gaunt, and he had sunken eyes that looked as if they hadn't seen daylight in years. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the cold, his breath fogging in visible puffs. It was the look in his eyes, though, that chilled me more than anything else. "You shouldn't have come here," he finally rasped, his voice low and gravelly. I swallowed hard, I didn't know what to say. "Who are you?" He didn't respond to my question but instead leaned over me, peering behind into the room. "The dead, they won't rest now. Not after you disturbed them." Ben took a step forward, his face pale. "We didn't mean to, we didn't know." The old man's eyes flashed to Ben, and his face contorted, pity, maybe, or fear. "You opened the door," he muttered, "you let them in." "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked, a quake in her voice. "We didn't open any doors." The old man's eyes narrowed. "The graveyard," he said in a low grave tone of voice. "It's cursed. Centuries ago, at least. The dead there are entombed under the weight of their sins. But they've been waiting. Waiting for someone to break the seal." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "The tombstones, with our names. What do they mean?" The old man looked at me, his eyes dark and hollow. "They've been marked for you. You stepped onto their land, and now they've claimed you. If you don't leave, if you don't find a way to stop it, they'll take you, too." Emily's voice shook. But how do we stop it? The old man hesitated, then glanced back over his shoulder at the dark woods behind him. There's a way, he said slowly. But it's dangerous. The dead, they want you. But you can undo what you've done. You have to go back to where it started. Back to the graves. I felt a chill run down my spine. You want us to go back to the cemetery? The old man nodded. If you don't, you'll never be free of them. They'll follow you. Haunt you. Until they pull you under, just like the others. Ben shook his head, panic rising in his voice. We can't go back there. We barely made it out alive. If you want to live, the old man rasped, you don't have a choice. We stood silent for a long time as the weight of his words made their way in. Returning to the cemetery would be like walking into a trap, but what was the alternative? We couldn't run away from them forever, and they always seemed one step ahead. The cabin felt less a haven than a cage. He turned to go, but turned back to us once more. There's a path. Follow it. But let me warn you, they'll try to stop you. They always do. And with that, he was gone into the night, swallowed up by the dark trees. Nobody spoke for a minute, still trying to comprehend all that he had just told us. My head was spinning, working it all out in my mind, the cemetery, the curse, the dead, they all connected, but how on earth could we stop it? We're really going back there? Jake asked, his voice quivering. We have no choice, I answered, my voice shaking as my fear spiraled. If we don't stop whatever's going on, they'll just keep coming. Emily winced in pain as she struggled to her feet, grasping at her injured ankle. I don't know if I can make it, she whispered. We'll help you, Sarah said quickly, supporting Emily. We'll get through this. Together. Standing by the door, staring out into the dark, Ben said, we need to move. Now. If what that guy said is true, the dead aren't going to wait for us to figure this out. I nodded, feeling my heart heavy with dread. Let's go. We left the cabin and plunged into the woods once more, the cold biting at our skin as we moved through the darkness. The trees seemed to press in closer, the wind whispered through the branches, a sweet soughing that sounded almost like the voices of the dead. But now we weren't running. We were going back. Going back to face them. Back to the place where it had all started. The trees seemed to hunch over us, gnarled branches twisted in a canopy of skeletal arms above. Every step we took thundered in the silence, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, watching us. There wasn't much of a path anymore, swallowed up by shadows and roots that arced up from the ground like overgrown arms, but we followed it anyhow the old man had said to. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, like something unseen was waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of the light from our flashlights. The others walked silently around me, their faces tight with fear and exhaustion. Ben led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, while Sarah supported Emily, who limped beside her, wincing with every step. Jake stuck close behind him, his eyes darting nervously between the trees. The whispers hadn't returned, but the silence was worse. It was one of those silences that made your skin crawl, that made you feel like you weren't alone, though you couldn't see anyone. We're almost there, Ben muttered, low, his gaze flicking back over his shoulder. I can feel it. I nodded, not so sure if I was in agreement. The closer we walked toward the cemetery, the louder my instincts yelled at me to turn back. Something was off about this place, other than a graveyard that was haunted. The dead weren't just angry, they were waiting for us. At last we reached the rim of the cemetery, old, rusty gates swung wide, headstones only partly discernible in the fast-fading moonlight. It was chillier here, the wind whipping at our skin as we went inside. It was as though we'd stepped across some invisible boundary, passed into a place where the rules of the living did not apply. I looked around at the others. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear, but none of us turned back. We knew what hung in the balance here. If we didn't do this, we'd never leave alive. We need to find the graves, Sarah whispered. I could see her breath in the chill night air. The ones with our names. I nodded. Let's split up. We can cover more ground that way. It wasn't the greatest of plans, but we didn't have time to squabble over it. We paired off. Ben and Jake went in one direction, toward the cemetery's far end, while Sarah and I helped Emily toward the older part, where the gravestones were more weathered, the names long faded with time. The ground was uneven, soft in spots where the earth had settled, and the trees cast long shadows that seemed to dance in the wind. As we walked further into the graveyard, I had that old the feeling that something was watching, waiting just out of sight. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A tombstone, newer than the rest, with my name etched into the granite. I stopped dead, my heart with the same rhythm as I glared at it. The stone was clean, and the engraving was sharp and precise. My name, Ethan Crawford, had been done in big bold letters, with a date that twisted my stomach. Today's date. Ethan? Sarah's voice was a tight circle of fear as she pulled to a stop beside me, her eyes darting wide at the sight of the tombstone. Oh my God! Emily gasped, clutching onto Sarah's arm. What does it mean? I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My brain was racing, trying to process the information. How could this be? How could they know we were coming? They've marked us, I said quietly, in a whisper. This is what he meant. They're waiting for us. A chill breeze blew across the graveyard, carrying with it the faintest whisper, gentle, far away, yet louder with each passing moment. I quickly looked around. The air was heavier now, as if even the dead themselves were weighing in upon us, watching from the shadows. We need to find the others, I exclaimed in a rush of words, grasping at Sarah's arm. Now. We wheeled and plunged back toward the middle of the graveyard, the wind rising with the whispers, which were getting louder now, more insistent. I could make them out now, calling our names, the voices interweaving into an unpleasant harmony that made my skin crawl. Then, just ahead of us, I saw Jake and Ben standing by another row of graves, their flashlights whipping back and forth in the wind. We found them, Jake yelled out with tension in his voice. The graves, they're all here. We joined them at a run. My heart was hammering in my chest. There they were, 5 laid graves, each one freshly dug, each one marked with our names. Ethan, Sarah, Ben, Jake, and Emily. This is insane, Ben muttered, shaking his head as he stared at the tombstones. What do they want from us? No one had time to answer before the earth beneath our feet started to shudder. The air was a little colder, the wind howling through the trees as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. They're coming, Emily whispered, her voice shaking with fear. We have to leave. Now. But it was too late. The ground burst open under the graves, tearing in two as something dark and twisted started to rise out of the ground. Skeletal hands dug up to the surface and pulled themselves from the dirt, their empty eyes directed towards us. The dead were coming for us. My legs turned to lead the instant those skeletal hands broke through the earth. I had never known such fear, it rooted me to the spot. My eyes were fixed on the figures rising from the graves, rising and pulling themselves free from the soil with snaps and crackles of bone. There were about 6 or 7 of them, all gaunt and hollow-eyed, all twisted in some grotesque manner or other. The dead had woken. Run! Jake screamed, his voice breaking through my paralysis. Run, now! We didn't need to be told twice. Sarah grabbed hold of Emily, who was half stumbling, and we ran, dodging between gravestones with crazy bobbing flashlights in the dark. The wind howled around us, whipping the dead men's whispers as they followed behind. Their voices scratched at the back of my brain with cold, accusing fingers, as if pulling us toward our graves. Where do we go? Sarah wheezed as we stumbled through overgrown grass in ragged gasps of air. I didn't have an answer. The cemetery gates were too far away, and the dead were gaining on us. I could hear the sickening scrape of their bony feet on the ground, and every time I dared glance back, I saw them closer, closer, their empty eyes locked on us with a hunger that made my blood freeze. Over there, he hollered, pointing at a large crypt in the far corner of the cemetery. It was old, its stone walls cracked and moss-laden, but the heavy iron door was still intact. We can hide in there. It was a poor sort of plan, but it was all we had. We ran toward the crypt, feet slithering on the wet grass as the whispers swirled around us, louder and more insistent. I could feel them now, not just in the air but in my bones, as if the dead were calling to me, pulling me toward the earth, toward the graves they'd prepared. Get inside. I yelled when we reached the crypt, fumbling with the rusty doorknob. That groaned in protest, the iron screeching as I pushed it open. Sarah, Emily, and Jake tumbled inside. Ben followed and slammed the door shut after us, the clang of metal on metal incredibly loud. For a moment, there was silence. The flashlight's beams flickered as we gasped in the dark, the thought of what had happened slowly setting in. The dead were outside. They were real. And they came for us. What? What the hell was that? Sarah whispered, trembling against the stone wall, her face pale with fear. They dug our graves. They were waiting for us. They're not just spirits, I muttered, my heart pounding against my chest. They are the dead, real and vengeful souls. For centuries, they have been here, and now they want us to join them. Jake shook his head, his eyes were wide, in utter disbelief. This is not happening. This can't be real. It's real, Ben said, the sound of his voice grim, wiping the sweat from his forehead. And unless we find a way to stop them, we don't leave here alive. The air was cold and damp inside the crypt, the stone walls slick with moss and mildew. Our flashlights cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the faint scent of decay clung in the air, like some crypt that hadn't been disturbed in decades. It was thick and heavy, the iron door. I didn't know how much longer it would hold the dead. They'd clawed themselves out of the ground. What was stopping them from breaking through a door? We need to figure out why they're coming after us, I said, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of everything. There has to be a reason. The old man said something about a curse, about the cemetery being cursed after a vengeful act in the 1800s. Revenge, Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. That's what they want. They want revenge. Revenge for what? Jake asked, his voice tight with fear. We didn't do anything. Maybe not us, Ben said, his face pale as he stared at the crypt door, but someone did. That's why this place is cursed. Someone disturbed them, and now they won't rest until they've had their revenge. She shook, hands knocked into fists, sitting against the wall as her gaze went distant. It's not just revenge. They want us. They marked us, dug our graves. They've been waiting for us to come here. A chill went down my spine as her words finally sank in. She was right. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about us. The graves with our names, they weren't just warnings, they were invitations. The dead had chosen us, now they wanted to claim what was theirs. We have to find a way to break the curse, I said, the steady tone of my voice a lie as the fear burrowed deeper into my insides. There has to be something, a way to stop them, to send them back. But how? Sarah was asking, desperation wide in her eyes. How do you stop something that's already dead? And before I could answer her, the door rattled. A soft scraping sound echoed through the crypt, followed by a low guttural moan that made me shiver. The dead had found us. The iron door had shaken violently, as if something or someone was pounding against it from the other side. The sound reverberated in the confined space of the crypt, each impact resounding through the stone walls, growing louder, more insistent. We were trapped, and the dead were outside, hungry and relentless. "They're here!" Jake gasped, backing up against the far wall, his eyes wide with panic. The moaning grew louder, and I heard the unmistakable scrape of skeletal hands dragging across the stone, feeling their way in. The door groaned once more, buckling from the pressure. I didn't know how much longer it would hold. "We can't stay in here," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking as she clutched at Emily's arm. "They'll break through. We have to do something." "But what?" Emily whimpered, her eyes brimming with tears. "There's no way out." I felt the same dread rise in my chest. The walls were closing in on us. Outside, the dead were relentless, and inside, we had no idea how to stop them. It felt as though the crypt itself was a tomb, already waiting to bury us alive. Then, with the pounding growing fiercer and fiercer, my mind began racing back to the discussion with the old man, the one who told us not to come here. He had spoken of a curse, a vengeful act from the 1800s that had tainted the cemetery. If somehow we could break that curse, maybe we could return the dead to their graves. "The curse," I muttered, my thoughts clicking together. "It's the only way. We have to break the curse." Jake turned to me, his face pale. "How? How do we break it? We don't even know what caused it." "We don't have to know everything," I said, forcing the fear down as I tried to think clearly. "The curse is tied in with the cemetery, with the graves. If we can find something that connects the curse to this place, maybe we can stop it." Ben, who had been standing near the door, listening to the ominous sounds outside, turned toward us. "There's this old legend," he said in a very low voice, "about a family who had been wronged here, murdered and buried without justice. People say that's why the cemetery was accursed in the first place. The spirits of the murdered were never at peace." Sarah frowned, her brow furrowed in thought. "So, if it is true, perhaps the spirits are not angry but rather waiting for someone to make it right, to give them their justice that they never got." "It's worth a shot," I said, feeling a spark of hope for the first time since we entered the cemetery. "If we find out who they were, potentially who cursed this place, and put things right, maybe the dead will go back to their graves." "But how do we find that out?" Emily asked, small-voiced, shaking. "We don't have time." I sent my gaze circling in the crypt once again, my flashlight beam flickering across ancient stone walls, until I saw something standing forth from the corner. Partly obscured by a layer of moss and dust, in that corner was a plaque, a bronze plaque, weathered with a name etched into it. "Look," I said, hurrying over to the plaque. I knelt down, brushed away the grime, and my heart skipped a beat at the inscription. "Here lies Annabel Grayson and her family, wrongfully killed in the winter of 1803. This is it," I whispered. "Annabel Grayson. This is who the curse is tied to." Ben knelt beside me, his eyes scanning the inscription. "If they were wronged, maybe their spirits have been trapped here, looking for justice. But how do we give them justice now?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. I stood up, my head reeling. "We have to find something belonging to them, something that sets their spirit free. Perhaps if we give back whatever is rightfully theirs, it would just set them at peace." "Like what?" Jake asked. "What could possibly still be here after all this time?" Just then, the door groaned again, louder this time. The pounding grew heavier and heavier, and I could hear the dead whispering our names, their voices low and threatening. We didn't have much time. "We have to find their graves," I said, my voice firm. "Their real graves. If we can give something back to them, something that's been taken from Annabel or her family, it might be enough to break the curse." Ben's flashlight arced through the crypt, then landed on a narrow passage leading deeper into the tomb. "There," he said. "That passage probably goes to where they're buried." We wasted not another second but moved forward to the passageway, flashlights whirring in the morning gloom, as deeper into the crypt we trudged, with each step the air growing colder, more oppressive. I could literally feel the presence of the dead closing in on me from every side, threatening to overwhelm me at each step. We couldn't turn around now. The passage opened into a small, enclosed chamber. In the center of the room stood 3 stone sarcophagi, each one engraved with the name Grayson. "This is it," Sarah whispered, barely audible, her voice full of wonder and fear. "These are their graves." We stood there, staring at the sarcophagi, the weight of what we had to do settling over us. I felt a strange sense of reverence, like we were standing in the presence of something far older and far more powerful than we could ever understand. "We need to return something to them," I whispered. "Something that will give them peace." Jake's eyes flickered towards a small, decaying chest along the edge of the room. "What's that?" I approached the chest, crouching with a creaking of the fragile lid. Inside, it was filled with personal items of old junk jewelry, letters, and a faded locket with a small portrait inside. "This," I said, raising the locket. "This would have belonged to Annabelle. It's connected to her." The door rattled more noisily than ever, and the crypt seemed to shake with the dead weight outside. "We need to go fast," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "They will break through." I nodded, my hands shaking, and placed the locket on top of the sarcophagus marked Annabelle Grayson. We all stepped backward, holding our breaths, waiting. For a moment, nothing did. The crypt was silent, the air was heavy with tension. Then, gradually, it started to glow, a soft ethereal light filling the chamber. The temperature in the room started to rise, and I could feel the weight of the dead become lighter, as if the curse itself was unraveling. "It's working," Emily whispered, a thread of hope in her voice. "We're setting them free." But just as the relief started to flood through me, the door to the crypt burst open in a deafening crash. The dead had broken through. Then the crypt door blew open, and shards of stone skittered across the floor. The dead surged in, a sea of skeletal hands reaching, hollow eyes fixed with a hatred so intense it seemed the very air was burning. Quick beyond the norm, the wave of death crashed down upon us, tattered clothes billowing as they surged forward. "They're coming!" Jake yelled, his voice cracking in terror as he stumbled backward, his back pressed against the cold stone wall. My heart pounded against my chest. The glow from Annabelle's locket shone bright and strong, yet it wasn't enough. The dead were enraged, driven by something older and darker than simple vengeance. They wanted to take us with them, to drag us into the earth, to share their cursed fate. "We need more time," Sarah cried, clutching at my arm, her fingers digging into the skin. The dead spilled to the edge of the room, their bony hands reaching out to us, passing like cold breath from a tomb through the air. The whispers filled the crypt, overlapping into a cacophony of voice pleading, raging. They were loud, and I could hardly think. She was crying, her back against a corner, her eyes wide with fear. "We are not going to make it." The locket was glowing brighter, pulsating with a warmth that pushed back the cold, but not enough. The dead weren't in retreat, but advancing, unstoppable, relentless. Then suddenly, there was a voice in the crypt. Not a whisper this time, something more. Clearer. "Peace." It was a soft voice, yet powerful, cutting through the chaos like a blade. It came from the locket. Annabelle's spirit. Instantly, the dead stood still. Skeletal hands froze their reach, hollow eyes fixed to the glowing locket. For an instant, all was silent in the crypt. Even the whispers. Annabelle's voice spoke again, serene and saddened. "You will not take them." A figure emerged from the light enveloping the locket. It was faint at first, barely visible, but as the glow intensified, the figure took form, a woman, dressed in the tattered, old-fashioned clothing of the 1800s. Her eyes were soft and sad, her pale face framed with wisps of dark hair. "Annabelle," I breathed, looking on in wonder as her spirit stood before us. The dead recoiled from her, their skeletons shrinking back as if her mere presence would hold them at bay. "They are not your prisoners," Annabelle whispered, her voice echoing in the crypt. "Your pain stops here." The dead stirred, their whispers becoming fervent. I could feel it building in the air, the weight of their anger at the sorrow lacing Annabelle's voice. They didn't want to let go. They wanted us. Still, Annabelle was stronger. She slowly, almost gracefully, turned to the sarcophagus that bore her name. Her fingers brushed over it delicately, and the emanation from the locket flared, suffusing the room in a warm golden radiance. The dead uttered a mournful wail, their forms rippled as if they were melting into the air. "I release you," Annabelle whispered, her voice heavy with sorrow. "Return to the peace you were denied." The light suddenly became blinding, the kind that made me throw an arm over my face. Energy pulsed through the air, I could feel it in the shaking of the crypt, the dead being dragged back into the dark from whence they came. Their wails echoed one last time before disappearing into the ether. And in a flash, it was done. The crypt was silent. The suffocating cold that had enveloped us was released, and a queer stillness supplanted it. Annabelle's form started dissolving, melting away into the light pervading the locket. She turned to us just before she disappeared, her sad eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you." And she was gone. The light in the locket faded away, and all went back to black. For a long moment, none of us moved. The air was lighter now, free of that heavy weight that hung over us since the very second we stepped foot in this cemetery. "We did it," Jake finally whispered, breaking the silence. "We actually did it." "We set them free," Sarah murmured, staring at the now dark locket on the sarcophagus. "It's over." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that it was finally over, the curse bound, the dead at peace. But deep within me, I knew this wasn't something that would ever really leave us. Yes, the curse was gone. But we had crossed a line, stepped into a world we were never meant to see. And that kind of darkness leaves a mark. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice hoarse from the fear and adrenaline. "Before anything else happens." Shaky-legged and with shaking hands, we emerged from the crypt and back through the narrow passage into the open air. The night was still, deathly quiet, as if the whole world was holding its breath in the wake of the storm. The graveyard, too, was very still. Its gravestones were bathed in pale moonlight. We didn't say a word while we walked back toward the gates. Nobody dared to look back, toward the crypt, toward the grave, toward the shadows, that just a few feet away from trees seemed to be waiting. We wanted just to get it all behind our backs, to forget. But when we reached the rusted gate, I could not resist turning back one last time. The cemetery was quiet now, the restless dead finally at rest. Still, something in the air felt unsettled. Like the graveyard itself remembered us, knew we'd been there, and was waiting. I turned away, my heart heavy with the weight of all we'd seen. We'd made it through. We'd gotten out. Still, I knew, buried deep, the dead never truly let go. They'd be waiting for us, in the shadows.